Your line is now muted.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the City and County of Denver webinar series. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be sent out to all attendees. I have everyone's lines muted to reduce background noise. My name is Erica DeLello. I'm a project manager for NORESCO, and we've been working with the Colorado Energy Office to sponsor these City and County of Denver trainings. And to enable us to keep providing these trainings, I will be sending out a short survey at the end of the presentation. And through that survey, you'll be able to sign up for AIA and ICC continuing education credits. We do want to encourage questions, so please use the chat function and I'll let our presenters know at the end of the presentation. To start us off, we have Christy provide us with an overview of Denver's community ongoing collaborations between the Offices of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency, and the Community Planning and Development. I'll let Christy take it from here.
Hi, everybody. So thank you for coming today. And I am going to just run through a bunch of information really quickly. There's a lot more that I could say on each topic, but I just kind of want to set a foundation for why we're doing these IECC trainings and why the IECC Denver amendments are something to watch moving forward in Denver so that you can get a bigger understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. So the first thing that I think is important to just say is that we certainly are caught up in and understand the uncertainty in the development community right now, and that there are some really big priorities that we're talking about that make it really easy not to focus on things that affect our environment and sustainability. But in actuality, we really have to focus on Denver's long-term viability, and that when we do that, we don't have the luxury of not thinking about energy. We have this list of goals and priorities that the community has brought to us, but equity, response to climate change, and affordability are all kind of at the top of the list with all of these other topics that tie into it and are part and parcel to the whole success of our community. But we really don't achieve any of those things without achieving all of those things together. Sustainability for our community and for Denver's long-term viability relies on us addressing the social issues and the financial issues that are immediately blinking in front of us, but also the environmental issues, because those affect different people within our city and elsewhere as well. So we don't have a choice to take a breath and step back from our energy work. So in looking at Denver's vulnerabilities and threats, we have a list of different factors. All of them are directly tied to building energy use. The energy use directly impacts them. So when we look at our project opportunities, we're trying to figure out what can we do with our Denver building projects that will positively contribute to this long-term viability of our community. And for buildings with greenhouse gas emissions, we know that homes and buildings are responsible for 63% of Denver's greenhouse gas emissions. And we also know that new buildings in particular are important because by 2050, 40% of the buildings that are standing will have been built between now and then. So we know that there's a big impact from our new buildings, and that's why we're so focused on the codes. That's not to say that existing buildings and cleaning up the grid are not priorities. There are separate ongoing efforts that the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency is leading. I'm just not going to talk about that, and we're obviously not talking about that today with our IECC discussions because that's not really what that code deals with. So related to the new buildings, it is our goal through the work that we're doing in the coming years to get performance on the same plane with aesthetics. This is something that's been happening nationally for years, and it's a process shift, and the code is, the changes and the amendments that we make to the IECC will help to support that shift. we know that we can't just pass a bunch of rules and run away. We want to work in conjunction with the community, and when I give this lengthier presentation, I say that about 200 times. We don't do anything without working directly with the community to make sure that we're bringing everybody together along. We're not just writing regulations in a bubble. So it's important to mention the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency, and I'll just call them CASR from here on in. This team existed under DDPHE, the Denver Department of Public Health and Environment. It was just formed as a separate office that reports directly to the mayor earlier this year. Elevating climate action and our ability to work on climate action is growing. It's 13 people right now with a plan to substantially add to that team. Obviously, current financial times have put some of those plans on hold for now, along with everything else. It's not a CASR statement, it's just where we are as a city right now. But that team has helped to set the groundwork and lay the foundation for the work that we're doing with the codes, starting with the 80 by 50 plan 2 years ago already now, a commitment for us to lower our greenhouse gas emissions 80% below 2005 levels by 2050. New buildings are part of that as a milestone mentioned in that plan, where we need to get to zero net energy for all new buildings by 2035. That's really soon. That's 5 code cycles away. That means that we're going to be acting pretty aggressively with our Denver Building Code amendments to the IACC. We're also going to be looking at how buildings are doing, how teams are doing complying with the existing codes. So we have a plan that we're writing to get there, because that's a really ambitious goal, and it's easy for everybody to look at that goal and say, that's crazy, that's high in the sky. So we are writing an implementation plan, and it will be done by the end of this year. It looks at energy efficiency, provision of renewable energy, electrification of buildings, and grid stability collectively for all new buildings. A big focus is in the energy codes, but it's important to know that we also have other codes that we're working on as well. Zoning codes, some of the regulations for our infrastructure plans. There are other departments and agencies that we're collaborating with at the city, but related to buildings, we have our IACC and Denver Building Code amendments, our Denver Green Code, which is a voluntary stretch code new this year, and the Green Buildings Ordinance, and that's what we have to work with. Why are codes so important? Because even though we have some really high-performing, awesome projects that I could go on about all day, because I'm so excited that we have them in Denver, they overall are not responsible for the major impact that we need to make on our building energy use. The vast majority of buildings that comply with the mandatory codes are the big green blob that we have to address. So that's why we really focus on our codes. So the CASR team secured funding through the American Cities Climate Change Challenge, which is awesome. It's money that's being given to 25 U.S. cities, $70 million over the course of 2 years, and it's helped us with an IACC compliance study, which is helping us to understand what to target in our codes, what to target in what we're doing with our plan reviews and with our inspections, and how to work better with our team so that we can get buildings to better performing outcomes. We are also going to need to be targeting with each of the next 5 code cycles some very aggressive Denver amendments. This trajectory shows that the national codes are not on Denver's trajectory towards our goals. So we have to make up that difference with our amendments. Residential, same story as commercial. So we started that process with the Denver amendments this year. We learned through the process. We asked the committee not to necessarily work towards one overall goal, but to do as much as we could. And we got pretty far. We got 15% better than base code, but it still didn't put us on the trajectory that we needed to be on. So we know that the process in the next 5 code cycles is going to require a partnership with the community to figure out how we do work to a goal and not consider each amendment in isolation, but all together to get to a goal in the most painless way possible. And that might mean that we need to add workforce training or provide other support and resources. One tool that we are using is the Denver Green Code, which is our voluntary stretch code. It serves 2 purposes. One is a leadership opportunity for projects to show the community what's possible, and we love it being used that way. The other is as a preview for base code amendments that are coming, because we are going to be pretty aggressive with our IUCC amendments, and we want everybody to know before we make those amendments mandatory what's coming so that the community can prepare and succeed. So we have all of the opportunities. We don't know exactly what the amendments will be over the next 5 code cycles because we'll be answering to the technologies that are available. I'm not going to go into the changes that we made in the IUCC this go around because that's what the rest of the presentation is about. Similarly, with the Green Code, we have the stretch opportunities, and they just expand beyond energy to broader sustainability, but again, with an outcome-based focus. I already talked about the purpose of the stretch code. We are offering incentives, hoping that that will help to gain community interest in using the voluntary code. And I can talk a lot more about that code, but I think the last really important thing to say is that there are 4 compliance options with a big focus on energy, because we know that energy is crucial to meeting Denver's goals. And then we have the Green Buildings Ordinance, which if a project precedes the Denver Green Code, it automatically is considered in compliance with the Green Buildings Ordinance. Otherwise, that ordinance is mandatory for buildings that are larger than 25,000 square feet and has been raising the bar on the performance of our buildings for the last couple of years since the voters brought it to the city and asked us to do this. There are 9 compliance options. Those options focus on holistic sustainability, but also energy efficiency, provision of renewables, and provision of green space in an equitable way so that everybody in our city can actually have access. We are using the Green Buildings Ordinance to learn about our buildings, and we'll be doing something similar with IUCC submittal requirements, just to start to close the gap between our building outcomes and what they're designed to do. And this is because we're seeing that that gap is pretty broad. Our buildings are being designed at a high level, but they're not performing at that level, sometimes using 2 to 4 times, often using 2 to 4 times as much energy. That's not because any one specific team member is failing at all. It is a big, complex collaboration to get a building to perform the way it's intended, and that is the gap that we are going to be aiming to close so that we can support the Denver community in achieving our goals and keeping all of our citizens healthy and well provided for. So the next group of slides, I'll just kind of flip through just to say that we, again, see the goal of sustainability as intermingled with equity and affordability as one goal. We're working across a variety of different city agencies and at a variety of scales. It's not just that we are addressing new buildings through the codes. There are a lot of other efforts going on at the district scale and the broader scale, and we're looking at the existing buildings and the sites and the neighborhoods. And we're looking to our project teams out in the community to increase communication and also collaborate in a similar way across all of the entities who contribute to projects, and to really start drilling in and understanding the metrics related to energy performance a lot better. So there are other things beyond code work that we're also looking at, other opportunities, other things that other cities are doing. We're looking at the planning level. We're looking at how we can integrate all of the different aspects of sustainability into the design of projects that are being built in Denver, because we're looking to how all of those projects contribute to the long-term viability of our community and our future. So that's just a summary slide, and then at the very end, I wanted to add in here, I think everybody probably knows that we have Chief Fox, who has stepped into a role to lead IECC within our teams and with the community, and so his contact information is here. And then I'm also working on all kinds of green buildings efforts and working with the CASTR team, so my information is there as well. So with that, I will hand it back. Thank you.
Thanks, Christy. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and grab those presenting rights and send them over to Shauna. All right, Shauna, you should have presenting rights now if you want to go ahead and share your screen. So we'll jump into the Denver amendments portion of the presentation now. And again, if you have any questions, please write in the chat, which can be generated by hovering over the bottom of your screen and clicking on that chat bubble. My presenter today is Shauna Mazingo, and she will answer any questions that you have at the end of the presentation. Shauna is the president of the Mazingo Code Group, as well as being a plans analyst and inspector for a jurisdiction. Over the past 8 years, she's provided code adoption assistance and training to code officials, builders, energy raters, and designers. She's a past president of the IECC Colorado chapter and has served on the IECC Code Development and Correlation Committees for the 2018 and 2021 code cycle. So with that, I'll let Shauna take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Excited to be able to bring this to you today. Now, today we're just going to talk about the residential provisions kind of from a plan review side of things. I know that previously Robbie had done the inspection side. So we're going to look at the plan review side and what can we expect needs to be shown on the plans so that the inspections can take place properly. So we're going to talk a little bit about mostly Denver's amendments. We will talk about what's in the code, but mostly for context as we propose the amendments. Let's just move forward. A couple of things that you have to know, there were some changes made. So typically, the IECC treats residential and commercial a little bit different than the other codes by just saying that maybe you could have some R2s, 3s, and 4s that are considered residential, even though they're built out of the IBC, so people automatically think that they're commercial and try to submit for commercial. Because there's been a lot of confusion over that, Denver did change their definition of a residential building to remove those R2 buildings. So R2s, your apartment buildings, are all going to be commercial now. And that's been removed from there. So just want to clarify that when you're submitting a project for Denver that's R2 or an apartment building, you're going to submit it under the commercial requirements of the Energy Code. That being said, that means we're not going to be discussing apartments today because today is residential. A pretty good change to bring some, to take the confusion out of whether it was 3 stories or less or 4 stories or more, and now it's just all one section of the code, so that's kind of nice. We are going to go over some definitions today, just some different ones, but I'm not going to go over them right now. I'm going to go over them while we're talking about where we need to talk about them, right? So there's some new definitions that got introduced to the Denver's IECC, and a lot of them also will be in the 2021. The nice thing about the Denver amendments is when Denver was writing their code, we were also writing the 2021 IECC, and so we were able to take, they were able to take a lot of those proposals right out of what's going to be in the 2021. So Denver will be ahead of the game. When the 2021 gets published, you'll be at least, if not more, than halfway there, and you won't have such a big learning curve, and then you'll be able to introduce some new things in 2021. So it's kind of nice that process kind of fell that way, and we knew what was going to be in the 2021 when writing Denver. So let's look at some of these general requirements and how they affect plan review. A lot of times you look in the code and you're like, well, how do I put that on a set of plans? And so everybody does it a little different. But in Chapter 3, that's your general requirements. Chapter 3, well, it also talks about climate zones. It talks about how things have to be installed, kind of your install instructions. And, that you have to label your insulation, you have to label your windows and those types of things. It also got added in there that you have to, when you're doing your insulation installation, it needs to be a grade 1 installation. So that's a ResNet HERS specification where they talk about grade 1, grade 2, and grade 3. Grade 2 and grade 3, when you're in that ResNet standard, is allowing you to trade off if you were using a performance path, you could maybe trade off some of your, maybe you don't install it so great, and so you're going to have to make it up somewhere else in the envelope. Well, because the code says insulation shall be installed to manufacturer's install instructions, and there's not an install instruction out there that's going to say, have lots of gaps, we don't care, because it says that in order to meet code, it needs to be a grade 1 installation, and we are not going to allow grades 2 and grade 3. So that just got kind of put into the code, so you're going to find this wording about grade 1 insulation installation, and there's places to find that, but it's basically a good install per manufacturer's install instruction, and it can't be traded off, which is a great thing. How do you mark that on the plan? So what I would say is when you're going prescriptive or even with ResCheck or something, it's not as big of a deal. I think, those insulation manufacturers or insulation installers know they have to do it. Where the concern is when you go a performance path maybe and you're using energy raters sometimes to do your inspections, because they are used to being allowed to do. That's where grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 came in, and so they're used to looking at what's there and grading it, and so you need to put it on, either mark it on the plans or mark it on your performance report or somewhere that they're going to see. Those guys, they need to not pass it if it's less than grade 1. So they're the ones that are going to need to be aware of this fact. A lot of them are, because we've been in Colorado really good about trying to make sure our raters are doing grade 1. But there's still some out there, with the change of staffing and everything. So we need to just really make sure that if it's for code compliant, it has to be grade 1. We're not going to accept grade 2 or grade 3. So be sure to get that on the plan somewhere where the rater will see it. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about paths of compliance right here. So in order to move forward, because there were some changes. So we still have that prescriptive path, which also includes ResCheck, and we have the simulated performance path and the ERI path. What I would say is if you're going prescriptive, that's just tell me what I have to do and I'll do it, and you follow the book. There's not a lot of trade-offs in there unless you use the UA path, which a lot of people know as ResCheck, which allows you to trade off some insulation and windows, and as long as you keep the right U factor. And so the change in that prescriptive path is bringing in this R407, which is additional efficiency package option. What the idea here was, it's just like commercial. Commercial has been doing this since 2012. But the idea is that we want to bring in more efficiency in our buildings. And so we could, how do we do that and still have a building that's buildable, right? So, or affordable to build, I guess. So how do we do that? We could have cranked the code down by another 5 or 10%. But instead of doing that, we say, okay, here's the code requirements now. On top of that, here's some options. You choose how you get the other 5%, or you choose how you get the rest of the way there. And so it provides options, and we're going to go over those when we get to that section. But that's what it's about. It's not like, oh, we're trying to go way, way, way above code and be an above code program. This is about, in order to meet the minimum requirements, you have to choose that additional option, but that option is there so that you can choose how you get the efficiency out of your building and what works best for your design, and not having to just tell you how to do it. And you have the simulated performance approach, which is it allows trade-offs. It's showing that your building performs, so we'll talk about that a little bit. But you also have to comply with the mandatory requirements. And so we'll talk about what that means in a minute. And then the ERI, the Energy Rating Index, that's where you use a score to show compliance with the code. That's been in there for a couple cycles now, and there were a couple changes in that, so we will look at that. What do I mean when I say mandatory? The code, at least through 2018 anyway, has the word mandatory in it. And so what does that mean? Isn't the whole code mandatory? in the energy code's a little bit different. It allows trade-offs here and there. And so what the word mandatory is letting us know that no matter what path you choose, no matter what you're doing, these items can't be traded off. You have to do them. And they're usually things like you have to seal up your thermal envelope and get good air leakage. You have to do good lighting. You have to do your right mechanical efficiencies and mechanical controls. But insulation, R values, U factors, those kinds of things can be traded off. Even duct leakage and air leakage can be traded as long as you make them up somewhere else. But the other things are mandatory. You can't trade those things off. That's what it's talking about. So making sure when I'm doing plan review, I'm always, looking, did they use a trade-off path? But no matter what, those mandatory requirements, that's for every path. I'm definitely have a little checklist where I go through and make sure they've met the mandatory requirement. Prescriptive is a pathway, so you could choose that path. That's just, I want to just tell me what I need to do and I'll do it. Res check fits in there, or that UA trade-off path fits in there, so you can make some, if you choose that path, you can trade off some envelope as long as you make it up. Maybe you put in a better window to get out of to lower the insulation in a certain place, or vice versa. But that's about it. But it is a pathway, and you can choose it. I just don't see very many people do it unless you're way out in some remote area where there's not a lot of people that know how to do performance. Sometimes can be more expensive to go prescriptive because you have to use these specific values, and you can't do a lot of trade unless you're using a little bit of res check. And then you have performance, which is looking at the overall performance of the entire building. And so that takes that usually has a third party involved that knows how to use that equipment or the computer program software, and can compare the building that you want to build to this building that's the code requirements, and how much energy are you using the way you want to build it, and it allows more trade-off. And so the thing that I would say is the documentation on these paths as a plan reviewer, what has to be on the plans. Prescriptive is strictly right out of the book. Are they doing what if it says that it needs an R20 in the wall, is that what they're doing? And performance is looking at that report that you get from the rater or whoever that says, okay, we're not going to do that R20, we're going to do an R15, but we're going to make it up over here with our really tight envelope, or really good lighting, or really good, there's different things that you can trade off. And so looking at those reports and making sure that they match the plan. That's the biggest thing that I see as a plan reviewer, is that I'll look at a set of plans. The rater or whoever's making the res check is putting in whatever value that they want you to get it to pass. But when you compare it to the set of plans, the plans might say 2x6 construction at 16 inches on center with R20 in the walls. And you look at the report and it says, 2x6 is at 24 inches on center with R15 in the wall. Well, the plans have to match so that that's what's getting built. So really that's the biggest thing between doing plan review to those paths. Additional documentation that needs to be included and is mandatory is the certificate. That certificate is so important. But I can tell you in I don't know how many years of doing this, very few people are enforcing this certificate. But the more and more we start allowing trade-offs, once you get that drywall on, how do I know what insulation's behind it? Once I take that sticker off the window, how do I know what U factor that is? When I go to remodel my house, everywhere in the code it says I can never make it worse than it was. How do I know what is in there? I can't see it. And so should I just assume that it's the code values? So I'll assume it was R20. Well, wait a minute. I traded that R20 off somewhere. So if I just go back and put that in there, maybe I'm making the envelope worse or whatever. So the more we're allowing trades, the more we need this certificate, and it's becoming more and more important. So you need to be making sure that somewhere on the plans you're identifying that they are going to be required to post this certificate. And usually you will get, if they went with RegCheck or a performance pass, those software programs all spit this certificate out. So you probably will get a copy of it at plan review stage even. But that needs to be posted. You know, it says that it has to be posted in the room where the furnace is located, or in a utility room or some other location that is approved. Usually it's in a utility room, or the furnace room is good because it's usually the furnace that has to be replaced first above all else. And in order to put in a good furnace, I need to know how my envelope was made, right? And so that's where it's probably needed first. So that's in there. There were some changes to it, just adding, you know, making sure that it gives you, if you used a HERS index score or a ERI score, I mean, what is that score, and what are your blower door results, what are your duct testing results, making sure that all of that is included. But also Denver included what I think is pretty good is this in 40132, your owner's manual requirement. So the requirement is to provide, that the builder provides a binder to the homeowner that includes all of the manufacturer's install instructions and everything to the owner when they take on the house. And so, you know, of course, if you have to have something, some stuff is required, like your furnace manual has to be on the furnace. And so there's those kinds of things are exempted out. But it also says, you know, provide, if you went RegCheck or you went performance, provide that report to the homeowner too, so that they can see how their home is supposed to perform. And so a little bit more a homeowner's manual, which is great. Some builders I've seen already do this, but now it's a requirement in Denver. How do you write that on the plans? You know, some people just say it's a little comment that it's going to be required. Anything you can do at plan review to let them know that this is coming. You know, if you think they're going to go read the code, it's just a good idea to put it on the plans and say, hey, don't forget this is going to be required later on. Saves them the time when they get to final inspection and go, oh, I was supposed to do what? And it holds them up a little bit. So anything we can do ahead of time. If they don't read the plans, then I guess we have another problem. Eve baffles. Eve baffles used to be, Eve baffles have always been a requirement in the code, but it was kind of prescriptive by accident. And so it's now mandatory. You shouldn't be able to trade off Eve baffles. It's a performance issue. And so it is a mandatory requirement. If you have a vented attic, you have to put this baffle in here so that the air that you bring in doesn't blow through the insulation, reducing its R value, and it doesn't blow the insulation over the top of the wall. You want the air to go up and over the insulation. So wherever there's a vent, you have to have a baffle, and it has to be as wide as the vent and be out of some solid material. How do you put that on the plan? You know, it's as simple as creating a sticker or creating a stamp. If you're doing electronic plan review, which a lot of people are doing now, you know, just creating I have a boilerplate stamp sometimes that I put on there. I'd rather put them on there than leave them off and hope they're reading the code book and then get held up in the inspection. I want the inspection process and the construction process to flow, right? I don't want them to get held up. It takes 2 seconds to put a stamp on there that says, don't forget your Eve baffles, right? And so whether they read their plan, if they get held up after I've put everything on the plan, then, I mean, that's a different lesson that they have to learn. But I'm going to put everything on there that I can. So there's some changes for floor insulation. There weren't a lot of changes for any of the other insulations when it came to Denver. So the floor insulation, and this change really wasn't in the R value, it was just in the install, and this will be in the 2021 also. Actually, Robbie got this in the code. Joe Stebrick got an exception in the code that, you know, the code has always said you have to install your floor insulation in permanent contact with the subfloor. So then if you wanted to run ducts or piping through there, it was underneath the insulation, and then it was considered an unconditioned space. Well, a lot of people wanted to run their piping in there so that it didn't freeze. And so how do you do that? So this is still an allowable way, but it's just one option now. And so now you can also you can drop your insulation down to the bottom of the floor, put in your full R30 right on top of the sheathing or drywall or whatever is right here, drop it down as long as you fully insulate all the way around, so you're basically building this nice insulated plenum. Then you can run your ducts and pipework in there, and they would be inside the conditioned space because they're on this side of the insulation and the air barrier. So that's an option. Sometimes you can't get an R30 in the floor cavity, so another option is, yes, drop that insulation down there, get as much as you can, and then get the rest of the way with a insulated continuous insulation on top of your drywall or your sheathing. So you could do your cavity insulation plus your continuous, add the two layers together to get there. So there's a little bit more options in there. Those were in there in the 18 and the 15, but it was really hard to read. So Robbie did a great job of getting the code cleared up and getting these sections in there a little clearer and more defined. So those are good options that are in there. Now let's talk about testing. Testing for air leakage, right? So the code is always required as a mandatory. You can't trade this off, that you do air testing, and your testing is at 3 air changes per hour at 50 pascals. Well, there's a couple things that make that a little bit hard to do, and so Denver has done, and the 2021 actual code will do this also, but is to say, okay, we understand that 3 ACH is very easy to get in a large home where you have a lot of volume of air, or and especially a detached large home where you have your own walls, you don't have any attached walls, and you have this large volume of air. 3 ACH with good detail is easy to get. We find that 90% of the people come in under 3 ACH even before that requirement ever got into the code. It's when you get a smaller house or an attached house that gets a little bit harder to do because you have less volume and you're dealing with walls that are those common walls that are hard to seal. And so accounting for that, they brought in this option. Instead of doing an ACH 50 test, you could do a CFM per square foot test. They would be equal in the end, but just a different way. So CFM per square foot makes you, it allows you to take that smaller volume and get the right result. That it was kind of, the cards were stacked against at an ACH 50 rate. And then it also allows a 4 ACH 50 or 0.22 CFM per square foot for attached housing, realizing that those common walls, it's hard to get the details just right and still meet all of the UL listings and everything of those walls. Sometimes it can be kind of hard to get that, so we'll allow a little higher for those attached dwelling units or for buildings that are under 1,000 square feet. 1,000 square feet or smaller, or for RX occupancies. This is a Denver occupancy in their building code that is really looking at, I think I have some information on it here in a couple of slides, but those are sleeping units. Those are not dwelling units, and they're like 400 square foot or less, so they're really small units. They still have to be tested, but they can come in at a higher rate. So that's good to know. It's not a rollback. It's just reality in saying let's give some options so that these guys that are in these smaller houses or attached houses have a fighting chance of actually complying. And so it's talking about dwelling unit enclosure area, which is a defined term in there that says it's just the sum of the area of the ceilings, the floors, and the walls separating dwelling units from conditioned space from the exterior or unconditioned space. And so that you're looking at the volume of all of this whole house and not just square footage. All right, so RX is it's a kind of a new occupancy in Denver. It's for residential. It's in the building code. It's a group of 2 or more detached buildings, each building consisting of a sleeping unit where there's occupancy is permanent in nature. They can't have a cooking facility. It doesn't say here, but it has to be 400 square foot or less. You still have to meet your building code, room areas like the 7 feet ceiling heights and minimum 7 foot areas, but you can't be over 400 square feet. And so there are some requirements in there. You can build them to the IRC or the IBC. They can't be more than 1 story. We're really in no basements, and they can't have a cooking facility. They can't have a kitchen in them, but they have a detached cooking facility that everybody shares. This is looking at maybe finding a way to deal with homelessness, and making these communities where you can provide these smaller units, and they just have one big kitchen or dining facility that's joint to all of them. But Denver's still wanting them to deal with homelessness and try to provide these communities, but also make sure and do the due diligence to make sure that they're energy efficient. So air leakage, we definitely are trying to keep all of the nasty air out, the pollutants, the allergens and stuff out, but we're also saying, okay, we paid a lot of money to heat or cool this space. We want that air to stay inside the building. And so that's why we're looking at air leakage testing. The blower door is just a test that, looks at how much air made it into the building and trying to say, okay, yeah, we have a little bit of air leakage. We want it to be, this much. We don't want it to be this much air leakage. We don't want to pay to heat and cool all this and have it go out of the building. And we don't want all of that nasty pollutants to come into the building. So that's what we're trying to do with a blower door test, among other things. There are different kinds of tests. If you have a detached house, it's pretty easy to just test the whole house and test the envelope. But when you have, a multifamily or a townhouse or attached duplexes or something where they're attached together, it gets a little bit harder to test that full envelope. And so you sometimes have what we call like a guarded test, where they look at different areas of the building and you have to compartmentalize the house, right? So if you're attached, you want to know what your pressure is of your house. You don't want to worry about what they're doing. What is my test? Am I passing? That's hard to do because if you have any leakage in this common wall, you're going to be pulling their volume and you're not going to pass. So how do you get a true reading? It is to really just have a guarded test where you actually put blower doors all around it. Or if you're an attached housing like this, you would test this house. You would pressurize both houses on each side so that you're really getting a truer reading here, and you're not pulling that air from that common wall. It's expensive, right? That's why it's important if you have attached housing to really get those details right. If you're a plan reviewer, it's important to make sure that they're getting those details right, so that they pass, because if they get the details right, they could actually test one unit by itself, but it costs a lot to have all of these extra tests or equipment. Not everybody has so many sets of equipment to be able to do this, so it's much more efficient to just get these details right. So as a plan reviewer, this is what I rely on when it comes to the mandatory requirements for air leakage. I'm making sure that this is what I'm looking at. This is my checklist. This is the builder's checklist. This table is mandatory in the code for a reason. We don't want you to get to the end and get 5 ACH and say, what do I do now? We want you to get to the end and go, oh, I got 3 ACH when, no problem. This is your roadmap to 3 ACH. So this is what I look at as a plan reviewer and make sure that each one of these components has their air barrier and air sealing. There are some insulation requirements in there too, but for air leakage, I'm looking at this column going, did they show me that they're sealed here? Do I have a detail for all of that? I have had some designers actually cut and paste this table and put it on their plan. That's fine. I mean, that's fine. At a minimum, I really make sure that I get details for like shower and tubs and fireplaces and stuff that are on exterior walls, because that's hard to come back and fix after the fact. But once that tub gets in place, it's hard to get behind there and make sure I have my air sealing and everything. So I really do take some time to make sure that is in place. And so it's good to get this detail as a plan reviewer. That's about what you're going to get for air sealing. I mean, how much are you going to put on the plans about blower doors? Can a house be too tight? No, absolutely not. Can a house be under ventilated? Yes, right? So the answer is yes. What we need to make sure, the house can't be too tight. People say, oh, well, if you make it too tight, you're going to get condensation on the windows. If you make it too tight, we're not going to be able to breathe. If you make it too tight and don't provide ventilation, if you have condensation on your windows, you don't have enough airflow, right? And the tight house is great, but we need ventilation in the house to keep that air moving, to keep things dried out, to keep people breathing, right? And so the idea is ventilation. So I like the fact that Denver did put a reference right in the air tightness section that says, oh, don't forget, you have to provide ventilation in accordance with the code. So it's nice. I definitely make sure that when I'm doing a plan review and I'm looking at air tightness, I am looking to see, okay, what did they provide me for their ventilation? Are they using an exhaust fan? Are they using a supply? Are they using an ERV, an HRV? What is their strategy and how are they controlling it? Because the mechanical code or the mechanical section of the IRC says, okay, well, if you're 1 to 3 bedrooms and you're, 1,500 square feet, you need whatever, 75 CFM. I'm just throwing a number out there. And so that's if you're running continuously. If you're running half the time, maybe you need 500 or 150 CFM. If you're running a quarter of the time, you need 300 CFM. That's a big difference in how many exhaust fans you need to run that system. And it never says that it's not allowed to run. It says you have to have an automatic shutoff. So what are you looking for? I always ask for, what control are you using? Are you running continuously? Are you running only half the time? Like, what kind of control are you doing that just a simple on-off switch doesn't get you there? So those are the kinds of things that I'm looking at plan review. Again, the M1505, which is the mechanical section of the IRC, will tell you what strategies you're allowed to use and how much air you have to bring in. So the plan review, that hasn't changed. It will change in the 2021, but it hasn't changed. Right now, you're still allowed supplier exhaust or a combination system. The 2021 will go to an actually requiring you to have a exhaust only strategy will no longer be allowed for building the building so tight that you don't want to suck all the air out because you don't have enough holes to bring fresh air in. So that won't work in the future. But right now it's still allowed. And so just making those comments on the plan. Right, so if I just use a positive supply and I'm pumping a bunch of air in, eventually when we build the houses really tight, you really want to, even though you're allowed a supply only, an exhaust only, or a combination, you want to think about the strategy. If you're a designer on the call or a builder on the call on this webinar, you want to think about this strategy. If you're under 3 ACH and you're getting down to below 2, you don't have a lot of holes in the building. You want to think about your strategy, right? So, if I use a supply only and I'm pumping the house full of air and I don't have enough holes for it to get out, what am I doing to that house? I'm going to force air out, and so maybe the holes that I do have are going to become larger holes over time. If I am using exhaust only, and I'm forcing air in, I'm exhausting air out and forcing air in through the little holes that I have, I'm bringing in with it whatever temperature that air is and whatever things are in that air, but I'm also forcing stuff through holes that I shouldn't be. So, you know, at 3 ACH, this strategy still works. When you start getting a lot tighter, you might want to think about a balanced system that lets as much air out as comes in, and so it flows. It doesn't have to be an ERV or an HRV. I have a lot of people that do use their furnace system with air into the return air side and supply out. And I mean, like, there's different ways to make it work. So just keeping that in mind. Something else that Denver has got into theirs is continuously burning pilot lights. So this is just, you know, you don't want this burning all the time. Of course, that's using up some resources, so we want to definitely make sure that they're not continuously burning. And then there, of course, are some exceptions for if you have gas appliances and you don't have the electric supply connection and it uses less than 150 BTUs. There's some different exceptions in there. So all of the codes are going to pretty much continuously burning pilot lights right now. Let's get into ducts. So we're in 403. That's your mechanical section. And so what this is just saying, that it used to be like, oh, you need R8 in the attic on your ducts and R6 anywhere else. Well, the code finally changed to say, you know, if I have a 3-inch duct and I have an 8-inch duct, why do I need the same insulation on them? So it went to being, okay, if your ducts are greater than 3 inches, you need an R8, and less than 3 inches, an R6, and that's only for, of course, ducts outside the conditioned space. Now, this is a confusing section in the code as it is, and then there are some Denver amendments, so I really want to make sure we understand duct testing and how we are going to handle this at plan review. It's mandatory that you test your ducts. We're going to see probably, I think, on the next slide, it's prescriptive, meaning it can be traded off on the amount of leakage. But the fact that you have to test is mandatory. In the code, it's always been mandatory that you test your ducts if any ducts are outside the conditioned space. But in the Denver code and the 2021 code coming up, you're going to test all the ducts, whether they're inside or outside the envelope. Right, so you're still using energy by having a leaky duct, no matter where it's located. And so so let's walk through that. All the ducts are air leakage are tested, except ducts for ventilation systems, as long as they're separate from your heating and cooling system. And then there is an exception in there that if you have your ducts, if the duct system is serving less than 1,200 square feet of conditioned floor area, they still have to be tested, but look at the rate of leakage that they're allowed to have. So it's a lot higher than your regular leakage, but that's for ducts inside the thermal envelope. So you're allowed 6 CFM per 100 square foot of conditioned floor area. That's if the air handler is installed at the time that you test. Air handlers can cause some of the leakage at the air handler. Even though the requirement says the air handler has to be sealed, there still can be some issues there. So you're allowed a little bit more leakage if you test when the air handler is attached, and 3 CFM per square foot without the air handler. The way that it's written up, it says, okay, 6 CFM per 100 square feet, no matter what. And then there's an added thing in there. If your ducts are inside the envelope, they have to meet 6 CFM per 100 square feet. So really, any duct that has to be tested meets 6 CFM unless you're that one exception where all your ducts are inside the conditioned envelope and the air handler, and you're less than 1,200 square feet, then you can be much higher. So you can still have your rough-in test or your final test, post-construction test. So how how do you write that on the plans, right? So I definitely always write it on the plans. A duct test will be required. Whether, especially you need to put it on there now because whether they're in unconditioned space or conditioned space, they're really going to need to know that now. It's always been known that I only have to do that if I'm outside the envelope, right? So we need to be letting them know that there was a change here, and you're going to need to know it. We're trying to help them through the construction process with our plan review, right? So we want to make sure that they don't get out there and be like, oh, had no idea how to test those ducts. Now I held up the project. So anything we can do is a bonus. How do I determine ducts in conditioned space? If you're going with a performance approach where you can trade things off outside of just insulation and windows, there is a huge, huge benefit. Anybody who's done modeling, computer modeling, could see that if I model my building with all the ducts inside the envelope, I get a very big credit and can get out of some other things, or lower, maybe not get out of them, but lower my insulation or lower, maybe get a different U factor of my windows or whatever you need to trade. There's a big credit for putting your ducts inside conditioned space when you're using a performance approach in that modeling software. So what do I have to do to those ducts to have them inside the conditioned space? This made it into the 18 code and got a little bit more refined in the 2021. So this is just saying if in order for it to be considered in conditioned space, it has to comply with one of the following, right? Completely located in the conditioned space inside the thermal envelope. That's kind of a given. Or you could bury your ducts. So if you're in a ventilated attic and you're putting your ducts in the ceiling, you could still call those ducts inside conditioned space as long as they're buried accordingly. There's a requirement in the code that says, put a certain amount of insulation under the duct, insulate the duct, and a certain amount of insulation over the duct, and then it can be called in conditioned space so that you can get that credit and performance. And you have to decide, is the expense of burying them worth the credit that you give, and usually it is, but it's also really great on handling moisture issues in the attic and all of that condensation. So it is definitely a huge benefit. And to be honest, the National Association of Home Builders are the ones that got this into the code because they found that much benefit into it. So into the national code. All right, if you're, so let's see, we talked about in conditioned space, inside the envelope, buried in your attic. The ceiling insulation R value installed against and above the duct is greater than or equal to the ceiling R value. So by the time you add up all the layers, you're at least equal to the value of insulation that's required by code. You can also, if it's located in the floor, you can call it in conditioned space, like a floor over a garage or something, as long as the air barrier is between the garage and the house, and the insulation, right? So there's an air barrier between the insulation and the garage or the unconditioned space, maybe crawl space, wherever it is. It's installed according to, your option in a floor, either against the sheathing or drop down and installed correctly. And you have at least a minimum R19 below the duct. Right, so that's if in a floor, and then you can also do it in a wall. If you want to do it and put your ductwork in an exterior wall. Most people are getting away from that practice, but you can do it. But you just have to put continuous insulation between the unconditioned duct and the unconditioned space in the duct, minimum R10 in the cavity, and then the rest of the cavity is filled. So there's some different requirements there. But actually they're options, so I call it a requirement, but there really are a lot of different options. That's what I love about the 18 code, is that it provides more option than any other code did. You might get more efficiency out of it, which is just a bonus, but it gave you so many more options. There's a lot of people trying to move to a newer code right now, and I'm telling you, 15 has the most options, and Denver even added more options, so that's great. Whole house mechanical ventilation system is just saying whichever fan you use for your ventilation system, it has to be this efficacy. Now, if you have a range hood and you're not using it for your ventilation system, maybe you don't have to go and make sure that the range hood, as a plan reviewer, I don't go and make sure everything is this efficiency. It's if it's the one that they're using for their ventilation system. I'm doing a residential study right now in Colorado, and this came up, and so PNNL and DOE and everybody clarified that, no, I'm not out there verifying that every single fan is this efficiency. I'm verifying because we're just talking about the fan in the ventilation, the whole house mechanical ventilation system that's required. Which one did they use? An exhaust-only strategy or what, or whatever. That needs to be that efficiency. So just making sure you're looking for that. Heaters, pools, and spas, there's some requirements in there about the controls for the heater and making sure that there's a readily accessible switch so people could turn it off. But then when they do turn it off, it doesn't just, reset all of the settings on the thermostat. And the switch has to be in addition to the circuit breaker for the power of the heater. Don't just use that circuit breaker. So those are some requirements in Denver for pool and spas. Lighting. So the code has been a long time, 50% lighting had to be efficient, then 75%, now it's 90% of the permanently installed fixtures have to be high efficiency. But there's a new definition for high efficacy lamps. So compact fluorescent lamps, LEDs, T8 or smaller, or other lamps or light sources with an efficacy of not less than 65 lumens per watt. So that's the change. It's also what will be in the 2021. There's a requirement here that's in the residential provisions of the code, and I really maybe this is something we need to look at, but this is a new section for exterior grounds lighting. But I want to be sure that you know that when it came in, when it was proposed, it was really for, like apartments and these R3s and R4s. Well, apartments got moved to the commercial, so now this doesn't apply for the apartments. They're going to have to do whatever the commercial says anyway. So this is really for your R3s and R4 ground lighting. So R3s and R4s, but only R3s and R4s that are 3 stories or less, have to comply with the commercial requirement, because it's a C, commercial, of the energy code for exterior lighting. This does not apply to any of your residential buildings except those R3s and R4s, 3 stories or less. So I'm thinking, as a residential plan reviewer, you're not even going to be looking at those because they're built out of the IBC. R3 and R4 is not occupancies aren't in the IRC, right? So our occupancies are from the IBC. So if you're getting an R3 or an R4, that's an IBC review. Maybe you have a different plan reviewer looking at it. I don't know how that's set up, but just be careful on how you apply this requirement for the exterior grounds lighting, where they have to go to the commercial section to comply, because it really is very specific to only R3s and R4s, 3 stories or less. Electric vehicles. All right. This is new to Denver. It is also going to be in the 2021. So it's not going to go away. Let's look at it. Buildings shall be provided with EV charging. So they give a whole section on electric vehicle charging. That's why you notice in the beginning we talked about all of those definitions for electric vehicles and stuff. In fact, I think I'm going to put it right here on the screen so that we can just kind of see the different definitions that we're talking about. This is Denver's code right here, and so you have electric vehicle, a definition, electric vehicle supply equipment, electric vehicle load management system, electric vehicle capable space. So that's a space that's provided with conduit and a dedicated circuit from the electric panel board to the parking space with sufficient physical space in the same building electric panel board to accommodate a 40-amp dual-pole circuit breaker. So it's a space with the conduit run and space in the panel board. Electric vehicle ready is a space that's provided with the 40-amp 280, 240-volt dedicated branch circuit for electric vehicle equipment that is terminated at a receptacle, junction box, or electric vehicle supply equipment within the parking space. So it's ready to be hooked up. It's capable to be run, right? So, and then you have electric vehicle supply equipment installed space, a parking space with the actual everything installed. So there's some different definitions there. Be sure you're familiar with those in order to do this requirement. So for dwelling units, if you have each dwelling unit with a dedicated attached or detached garage or on-site parking spaces has to provide at least one electric vehicle ready space. So the conduit is run. The power is run. The branch circuit shall be identified as EV ready in the panel board, and the termination location shall be marked as EV ready. So we're going to let them know what's going on. One space, if you have attached, detached garage or a parking space, has to be electric vehicle ready. And so then if you have 3 or more dwelling units or sleeping units attached, right, or group or occupancies with 3 or more dwelling units and or sleeping units shall be provided with EV spaces according to a table. So we'll look at that in a second. Well, before we look at the table, you just need to know that if you calculate that you need 3.5 spaces, that means you need 4. You round up. Hitting the wrong button. That all electric vehicle supply equipment installed, EV ready, and EV capable spaces are to be included in the calculation for the number of spaces provided by planning and zoning. So usually, this gets pretty tricky right here. So planning and zoning tells us how many parking spaces we need. Usually they say, okay, you're going to need, 50 parking spaces. These are included in that calculation, not on top of that calculation. But what I want to know is who reviews for this and enforces this. Is it planning and zoning because they determine the number of parking spaces? They're going to look for if you have electric vehicle. Is it the plan reviewer, the building plan reviewer? Is it the electric plan reviewer? These are things that you'll have to make sure that you get worked out ahead of time on. Who's going to make sure that they have the right number of electric vehicle parking spaces, and that they have the right, if it's EV ready or EV capable or EV installed, yes, it's going to have to go to that electric plan reviewer to make sure that all of that is done correctly. But who else has to be involved? So just making sure that you have that figured out ahead of time. Construction documents have to designate all of the capable spaces, all the ready spaces, and all the installed spaces, and the location of the conduit and termination point. So that's where we're at plan review. The panel board has to certify the reserved spaces for all of those, and the conduit for space has to be clearly identified at the panel board and the termination of the parking space that it's for EV. So, plan review is simply looking, did they have all of those spaces? Did they document the right, conduit and all the right things and clearly identify everything? Then you need to consider accessible parking. I'm working with several jurisdictions right now a lot of jurisdictions are adding EV to their existing 2018 because they know it's coming in 2021, so they want to be ahead of the game. What we're dealing with now is how do we handle accessible parking? I don't want to make my only EV-ready space or capable space the handicap one, because then people will be parking in that handicap space, that accessible space that shouldn't be. But I don't want to make my only space not accessible, because then if I need that space, so you have to be careful with that when you're writing your plans and when you're doing your plan review. Denver does say that where you have EV installed spaces or new EV ready spaces and accessible parking are both provided, that at least one of those accessible parking spaces have to be EV ready or EV installed. That's good. I don't know. I guess I should read the language again, because now as I'm thinking through this, at least one of the accessible parking has to be that. But what if you only have one requirement for one? Can it be in the parking? I think you would have to do one in each, so that you don't have people stealing parking spaces from each other. But here's the table. So if you are, number of EV ready spaces, if you only have one parking space, you only need one EV space, one EV ready space. You don't need any capables or installed. If you have 2 to 9, 1, and then 20% are capable and then installed, and then 10 or more. So here's your numbers. So who's looking for this on the plans? It's going to be really common, of course, at apartment buildings, which you're not going to be looking at for residential plan review anymore. But what about or at least not for energy code? What about, any other complexes or places that have a lot of duplexes and they have or townhouses and they have shared parking spots? So, and even a detached house that has an attached or detached garage now. So just be aware you have to look for that. All right, pathways of flexibility. Pathways equal flexibility. We don't have just one way through the code. I'm only going to talk about, we talked about prescriptive and simulated performance. There really weren't a lot of changes to those paths, so I'm going to talk about ERI, where there was a change made. That's the Energy Rating Index path, so that you can make sure your plan review is according to that. I just wanted you to know there's a lot of confusion out there when somebody's going with the ERI path that now allows a score to comply. An ERI score with the IECC per the code is different than a HERS index score. They are often, confused with each other. HERS is a brand, just like, we say, oh, grab a Kleenex. Well, Kleenex is actually the brand name of tissue. Right? Or, oh, I'm just going to Coke. Well, or, I'm going to Xerox something. Those are brand names, just like HERS is a brand name. And so using the Energy Rating Index is what we need to be getting used to doing, and that is different than a HERS score. So a HERS index is an asset rating. That's saying, okay, I'm a builder. I'm building my house. Somebody's going to come in and look at what I have done and give it a score. It doesn't have anything to do with code compliance. It's just saying, here's what I built, score it. Whereas an ERI rating is saying, okay, here's what I built. Does it meet code? And if so, what is that score? Right, so there's two different things. Builders often try to go with a HERS index score to show that, wow, look at how good my house is performing with energy. And it gives a score from 0 to 100. The lower the number, the better. 100 is used to be a house built to the 2006 code, and so the lower the score, the better. As we started going through it, we started diverging between the score and the code a little bit. So we're going to talk about what that is. A score of 0 is a net zero energy home. And unfortunately, DOE has determined that a score of 130 is about an average existing home, not a new home, but an average existing home. So we're trying to stay definitely below 100. But a HERS score doesn't meet code compliance. So as a plan reviewer, if you get a HERS index score that says 47 and you have to be 56, you're like, okay, it works. That's not all there is to it, right? We need to look to make sure that we're using the energy rating index score and not just the HERS score. And I'll tell you, why they're different. But first, Denver's amendment, the score has changed a little bit over the last couple cycles because of different backstops that they've put in there and mandatory requirements. But right now, the score in Denver per Denver's amendments is 56. So making sure that you get that score of 56, and you still have to meet all the mandatory requirements that are listed, and in Denver's amendments, it also includes 403.5.3, which is making sure that your hot water pipe installation is installed. You will be required to meet the hot water pipe installation. All right, so mandatory requirements of the code, that we talked about that a little bit. Prescriptive is just telling you, here's what you got to do to meet the base minimum of code and all of those requirements. But then mandatory says, okay, you have to have that certificate. You have to meet your air leakage. You have to do that air barrier and insulation table. You have to seal your ducts. All of these things that you have to do. You still have to do those. It looks like this when you're doing an ERI. It's kind of like this twin house. It's computer modeling to say, here's how my house is going to perform, and here's what score I'd give it on the zero. How close am I to zero net energy? And it's a twin house concept. If you take two houses side by side in a computer, one of them's meeting the mandatory requirements of the code, and one of them is meeting the what they want to put in there, and seeing, okay, here's how I want to build it. Here's what the code says. How close am I, and am I equal to or using less energy than that house? And so you just have to have a lower index rating than what it would be at code. So equal to or less. So you're at 56 or less, and you're golden. Seems really hard to meet, but there are a lot of things that can really affect that score that you can't use in any other pathway. I can put in high-efficient mechanical equipment and lower my score. I can put in solar and lower my score. I can get more lighting efficiency than the code requires and lower my score. I can build a better, tighter envelope than the code requires and lower my. The possibilities are just a lot out there. So it's good to become familiar with that score. In the 2015, in our climate zone, you had to get a score of 55. In 2018, it went up to 61 for some various reasons, but Denver has amended it to be 56, which is probably a little bit more reasonable with the changes. So that's the score that you have to get, but again, that's an ERI, IECC ERI score, not a HERS index score. So you still have some backstops. The 2015 said, okay, well, if you're going to use solar on your home or whatever, you no matter what, you got to build at least to envelope to the 2009 code. You can't just trade off to nothing. And the 18 says if you use solar, you have to at least build an envelope to the 2015 code. The idea being that if I use a bunch of solar to drop my score down to get me under the 15, if I move or I change ownership or something happens and that solar goes away, I don't want to be left with this horrible house. So we still have to build a good house and then trade on top of it. So that's what that's looking at. So here's the basics, though, really. There's not a lot of change between 9, 15, and 18 when it comes to the envelope in our houses. The biggest change, there was a change in 2009 about the attic insulation and the basement wall insulation and the windows. But in 2018, none of that changed. The only thing that changed was this U factor of the windows has to be 0.30. So that's really the only change. So you're still building pretty much the same house anyway. So a HERT, a Home Energy Rating Certificate, isn't code compliant, so just knowing that you have to get something, that's this a home energy rating certificate. That's just rating the home as it is, not whether it meets code or not, just rating the home. That gives you a score. It's a great score, but it does diverge a little bit, and it mostly has to do with ventilation. What you need to be seeing are these reports, which is the same software, the same everything is used. You just have to click a different button that says, you know, that this home meets the energy rating index of the 406, of the 15, or of the 18. That's what you want to see. Then you're getting an ERI score and not a HERS score, right? So you're getting an ERI score with PV and an ERI score without PV. So, you know, that's fine if they do an ERI score with PV as long as they're building that envelope to the right code, right? So just making sure that you're getting the correct report when you're doing that. Why is there a difference? It's because of the way that the HERS index is written versus the IECC. They're written in totally different processes. One's an ANSI process, one's a consensus process, and they're written at different times. And so the 18 does reference the ANSI standard, the ResNet standard that the HERS score comes from, which is fine. So we're getting closer to bringing those scores back into alignment. However, the score, it's saying to use them except for the ventilation is different. The rates of ventilation, the amounts of ventilation are different in each code, so that brings the scores to diverge. So because one used an ASHRAE 62.2 older formula and one used the newer formula, now they're diverging. One requires more ventilation, one requires less, so it does definitely make the scores different. And because so they're starting to diverge, and what happens is IECC references a standard, whatever that standard was in place at the time the code was written. So at the time the 2018 code was written, the 2014 standard was in place, so that's what we get, and that had a different formula than the newer ones. So ResNet isn't tied to the code. A HERS score isn't tied to the code at all, and so it uses the most recent version of its own standard, 301. Well, the most recent version is 2019. It has a different formula in it, and ResNet is dynamic. HERS is dynamic, meaning as the standard changes, it changes. It doesn't go on like a every 3-year cycle, so it's always changing, and so that brings it apart. And so the 2021 will use the 2019, so it'll be static. Whatever's in that 19, when it's adopted, that's what you get for the whole 3-year cycle, whereas HERS, whatever it is today, is what you get. And so they can be diverging as long as that always occurs. So just making sure, I just want to go through all of that to make sure that you are getting the reports that you're getting from your third party are to the code and not just a HERS rating. Whew. Compliance reports are mandatory, and it does say that those compliance reports that you get from the rater or from, are mandatory, and that the certificate is required for all of the paths. If you go prescriptive, it doesn't matter what, all of the paths require a certificate that has to be put on there, and a duct leakage report and an air leakage report. The Denver codes, all the codes say you have to turn in this report that says what my leakage rates were. And so those are required across the board. Now, if I go, if I'm looking at specific paths, if I go prescriptive, I just have to say on the path, there's a requirement now in the 2021 especially, says I have to declare what path I chose, so that the plan reviewer can say, okay, they went prescriptive, I need to look for this. Oh, they went with res check, I need to look for this. Oh, they went performance, I need to look for this. So that now has to be declared on the plan, and you still have to provide that installation certificate and those reports. If you go with res check or the UA trade-off path, you can go with res check or some other report that says here's what I traded off and here's my total budget U factor for that and the installation certificate. If you go with performance, what is that performance report that shows that the way I want to build it is still going to cost less in energy than the way that I built it, if I would have built it to prescriptive. Provide that performance report and the certificate. And then, of course, ERI, you're going to need that report that says, here's my score, and it is a energy code score and not a HERS score, and my certificate. So making sure you're getting all of that documentation. How do you plan review for that? You know, you're going to look at the plans. Here's the thing. No matter what, manual J's are a requirement, in which is showing how you calculated your loads to make sure that you're putting in the right heating and cooling equipment. When you're doing a plan review, you have to take the set of plans, you have to take that manual J, and you have to take the res check or whatever they, turned in, and make sure that they all match. One of them can't say that they used R20, and one can't, and then the other one says that they used R30, and the other one says that they used, R15. And the framing should be the same on all of them. Everything should be equal, so that the way the designer designed it, the way the guy's sizing the equipment, and the way that somebody's looking at it in the field, they're all the same. The way we've evaluated energy compliance is all the same, right? If they shouldn't be off, because the plans are the way it's going to be built, hopefully. So if the manual J or the res check are saying something completely different from that, then all they're doing is giving themselves credit to get out of something or to wrong size something or whatever, and that's not actually how it's going to be built. So you're not getting a true story across it. So making sure that they all match is totally key. If you're, again, on performance, you're going to look at those plans and that manual J and that performance report and make sure they're all kind of calling for the same thing. Performance is a little bit different because at plan review, I can go through performance and say, okay, I'm going to say I'm passing using 2x6s with R19, which you can do in performance. Right? So, but then I get out in the field and they use R18 or 17 or 15 or whatever they use, and it was less. So at the end, as long as they still pass, maybe they made it up somewhere else during construction. At the end, as long as they still pass, I'm okay. But knowing that, you have to demand that they turn in those performance reports at the end so that you could see that they still passed. What they said they were going to do at plans hopefully is still what they did at the end, but you want to make sure of that. And so that's great that Denver has required that in that binder that gets turned over to the homeowner, it includes that performance report. You can see, here's what you did, and yes, you still passed. But at plan, you're still checking to make sure that it's all consistent between the same and the same at ERI. The simulated performance path and the ERI use the exact same software and the exact same people. It's just different buttons you click. One is a cost report. Am I saving, is the house I'm building costing less in energy than if I built it strictly to prescriptive code? And this one is using a score. Is the score equal to or less than what if I built it to code? So built it to prescriptive code. So those are just things to know while you're going through this process. All right. Now we're going to get into 407. Anybody who's done commercial plan review is probably used to this because it's been, like I said, been in there since 2012. This is the additional efficiency package option. Instead of looking at this as, oh my gosh, one more thing I have to do, or oh my gosh, here we go, more stuff, I would challenge you to redirect your focus. I would challenge you to look at this as, wow, look at the options we have available to us. They could have dictated what you did, but they gave us options and let us choose what we want to do. That's how I look at this every time when I'm on a committee or when I'm helping somebody write their code or I'm teaching it. These are options. We could have told you what to do, but we gave you the options of what to do instead. So I would challenge you to look at it that way. We want to get more efficiency out of our buildings, but we're going to let you choose what works best for you to get there, with some guidelines in it. So you have to choose at least one of the following. You can choose more, but you have to choose at least one of them if you're going prescriptive. If you're going performance with either the simulated performance path or the ERI score, you don't have to do this because you're already going to show that your building is performing at the right rate. This is talking about this path. You have to choose one of these to get to the same as a performance. So your options are get a better building envelope. We're going to go through these. Do better insulation. Do better mechanical, better water heating design, better duct system, better air leakage, or better lighting. Some of them are going to be no-brainers, but these are your options right now. I will tell you that 407 did come into the 2021, but in a way more complex fashion. So you are going to have 407, these efficiency packages to deal with in the 2021. If you're outside of Denver, it's just right now in 407, these are your options. In the 2021, it's going to be this big, huge, like 4 or 5 pages worth of point system. You got to get a certain amount of points in each climate zone, and so it looks a little bit more complex. That was put in front of Denver, but the testimony when I was there was that they didn't want to bring in that complexity right now with these. We'll wait till the next cycle and see how that goes. So right now, these are more simplified options. Enhanced building envelope, that just means you're already required to get a blower door test, but so now, this is the UA. So you have to build a good envelope. This is just saying I'm going to build a better envelope. Maybe I'm going to get that res check and it's going to pass 5% better than code. So I'm going to do 5% better in my thermal envelope, which is, my framing or my windows, my insulation or whatever, somewhere in there, or a combination of all, I'm going to get 5% better on my thermal envelope. How does that work? So a lot of people use ResCheck to do that, and so ResCheck is like the same twin house concept that we talked about. It's just looking at, if I built the house to code, here's what my U factor for my entire building thermal envelope would be for the whole area. But here's what I want to do. What is that? And so as long as this is 5% better than that, you could comply. And it's, it allows you to use some trade-offs of insulation, wood. Maybe if you put your framing at 24 inches on center instead of 16, that gives you a much better U factor because wood has got like R1 per inch, whereas insulation can get up to 5, 6, 7 per inch. So less wood is good, right? And so, or maybe you're putting in a better insulation or a better window. What are you doing to get that better U factor? Anything that has an R value can be turned into a U factor. It's just 1 over R is U. And so you can convert anything like your framing materials and building materials into a U factor and see what your U factor is using like ResCheck that says, okay, here's how much better than code you were. You would just need to say you were 5% better than code to choose this option. You also have the option of better HVAC equipment, so 5% more, or a better equipment, so greater than or equal to 95 AFU. You say a 95% furnace, a 10 HSPF, or 15 SEER heat pump, right? So it's just asking you to put in. We can't ever require that you go higher efficiency than the 80% that the code that the NACA requires, unless it's an option, and this is definitely an option. Right? You can put in a 95% or better and meet the code requirement. You can put in a better hot water heating design and, either better hot water equipment or some solar thermal or something to meet the requirement. I love solar thermal. More efficient thermal distribution system. That's a better duct design and a better duct testing, a better duct leakage. But everything's inside the envelope and performing well. So 100% of everything is inside the envelope, the air handler, the ducts, and everything that way. You can do better air leakage. So if you're doing 2.0 air changes per hour or better, then you've met the requirement. So, or lighting. So you can do high efficient lighting. 100% of your lighting is high efficacy, which this has to be wrong because a high efficacy is 65 lumens per watt and this says 75, so I need to check that. But so you can do 100% high efficacy instead of 90% and be there. A lot of people will choose this. A lot of people are already doing all high efficacy lighting, or they're already doing high efficient mechanical, so those will be pretty easy options for them to choose right now. But how does this look on the plans? When I'm doing commercial plan review, I'm always looking to see what did they choose, what did they choose as their option, is it documented, and making sure that, so say they did this high efficacy lighting, that this is their choice. Where did they identify that, and does their lighting plan match? Residential, you don't always get a lot of lighting plans, so it's a comment, hey, 100% of your lights have to be high efficacy because you chose that as your option. Or on your mechanical plan section of the plan, or your manual J, making sure they chose 95% because that's what they said their option was going to be. Right, so you have to make sure that they chose one of these options and then make sure all of the documentation says the same thing. Their energy report, their ERI, their whatever, everything says this option was chose or that they're meeting that. So that's at plan review. Historic buildings, there's a couple things for historic buildings, not any huge changes, but, already I would just say that the requirements for historic buildings that got into the code already came a lot from what Denver had been writing. We had taken what Denver wrote a while back and got it put into the national code. So Denver really is leading the way in a lot of places. But so there's just a couple tweaks that got put in here. So it's just saying that nothing in this code applies to historic buildings as long as you can show that you've met the requirements, but they're not mandatory for historic buildings, provided that you provide a report submitted to the code official that says why it would threaten, degrade, or destroy the character or historic form or function of the building to comply, or that the State Historic Preservation Office provides a letter that says that, or that the local historic preservation authority having jurisdiction provides documentation to the code official. So you'd have to, you get to say you're out of all historic buildings don't have to comply with the code. No, we want you to put some thought into it. So you tell us why you shouldn't have to comply. So if you're a historic building, just making sure you're getting that documentation and that it's coming from the right person, right, that's allowed in the code. Then the only other changes in this path were for additions. There were some additions to existing building systems. Or portions shall conform to these provisions. That's not a change, but it can't create a hazard or condition worse than it was. They can't make the building worse. That's always been in there. The change is in here. So an addition shall be deemed to comply with the code where the addition alone complies, or where the existing building and the addition comply with the code as a single building, or where the building with the addition doesn't use more energy than the existing building. So that means you're building a pretty good addition in order to have it when the two of them added together don't use any more than it did without it. right? So that's how, and trying to figure out how you do that is sometimes people will do a blower door on the house before you do the addition and one after, or and just make sure you're not worsening the air leakage, or do a report on the house before and a report after to make sure. Then you have air leakage rate of the addition has to comply where the air leakage rate, the addition and the alteration that are part of the project is less than or equal to the air leakage rate of the existing building. So same, you can't use more energy and you can't have more air leakage. So you're going to do a pre and post blower door, and it can't be worse. How do you rate? I mean, like putting that on plans is pretty key to make sure that they know this is coming. So it's simply comments of, you know, making sure that they know there will be required a pre and post blower door when you're doing an addition. You can also do an ERI to show compliance by doing a score pre and post. You know, the addition shall comply where the energy rating addition index of the addition and the existing building, and any alteration is less than or equal to it if it was modeled for the existing building, so you can't be worse. And so it gets tricky modeling an existing building because you don't know sometimes what that insulation value was or what those window values were, and so you either have to do a lot of assumptions or something, and so that's why it's really great when they have those certificates, because you say, oh, here's what went into that house. You know, not a lot of times do we have records back that far. It'll get better now that it's electronic, because you can keep electronic stuff a lot longer than you did when you had buildings full of plans, but you still don't have access to a lot of that old information, so you have to do a lot of assumptions. That's why it's nice to have those certificates, just saying. All right, there are appendix in the code. Appendix in the code do not apply unless the jurisdiction adopts them specifically, which they have adopted Appendix RA, the solar ready provisions. This is just saying all houses need to be solar ready. All new construction needs to be solar ready. Solar ready for this code is a lot at plan review and not a lot actual in the field. However, Denver has a couple amendments to it. So what this is just saying is that, you know, the solar ready provisions go through and make sure that the house has enough roof space and that roof has been evaluated to handle the load, and that, you know, that it's facing the right way or whatever, then it can be ready for some solar on it. Because if I want to put solar onto an existing house, by the time I have to go pay for it all to be evaluated and looked at, that costs a lot more than where it doesn't when it's being designed right up front. You're already designing to a load, make sure it's got solar load on there too. You're already looking at it, so, you know, just make sure of this while you're building it instead of adding all that cost to me after the fact, right? So that's the idea behind the solar ready provisions in the code. There are some exceptions in there where you don't have to, you know, if you don't, so new detached 1- and 2-family dwellings and townhouses with not less than 600 square foot of roof area that's pointing in the right direction will have to comply with the requirement. Now, if you have less than that amount of area, or you don't have any roof area pointing in that direction, that'll be interesting. You don't have to comply. Or new residential buildings that already have permanently installed on-site renewable energy systems of some sort don't have to comply. Or building where all the areas of the roof are in full or partial shade, more than 70% annually. So it's really just wanting you to put thought into your design so that it's evaluated and easier, so somebody wants to come in and put solar on after the fact they could. There's such a huge it's just hard after the fact, because there's a huge cost to go back and get it all reevaluated when you could have just said, yep, we've evaluated for it, it's ready for you. And looking at also the roof penetrations, they need to be sleeved and prepare for a future conduit. So making sure you have a this is a Denver amendment, you know, to make sure you run that sleeve and that there's a capped sleeve there ready for conduit in case somebody wants to do it. It has to be a capped roof penetration shall be provided adjacent to a solar-ready zone located on a roof of not greater than 1 in 12. The sleeve shall be sized to accommodate future PV conduit, but shall have an inside diameter of not less than 1 1/4 inches. And so there are some requirements in there. So those are pretty much the, you know, when you're doing plan review for that, you're going to need to just make sure that do they have more than 600 square foot of roofing and pointed in the right direction? And if so, did they meet the requirements of that appendix? That's Appendix RA in the Energy Code. It's also in the IRC. So just making sure that they are meeting those requirements with Denver amendments for the capped sleeves and stuff, so that they are, they're prepared for that. That is what I have as far as amendments and everything. I think that now, Erica, if you have questions or want to discuss anything, I'm ready.
Great. Thanks, Shauna. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and open it up for questions now. Doesn't look like we've got any in the chat right now, but feel free to write in the chat or unmute yourself to start a discussion. Either way works. In the meantime, I did want to highlight a couple of additional resources that the Colorado Energy Office provides. We have put together a code adoption toolkit that reviews cost implications of changing code cycles, the benefits, other compliance resources, and more. We're also working on a troubleshooting guide that will cover iCode conflicts and alignments, clarifications, and passive compliance. So the code adoption toolkit is now posted on the Colorado Energy Office's website, and the troubleshooting guide will be there soon as well. So feel free to check those out and provide any feedback to me if there's other information that you would think would be resourceful. So with that, yeah, Shauna and I will stay on the line. If there are any questions, I know that was a lot of information, a lot of technical information. So if you have questions later on, I'll be sending out an email to follow up, and it will have Shauna's info on there as well. So I did get a question about a copy of the slides, and the slides and the recording will be posted, and I'll be sending out a link to access that in addition to the post-training survey. So just keep an eye out for a follow-up email. We do have a question, Shauna, and when do the changes take effect?
So it looks like now, because of, you know, the COVID caused a little bit of delay in just about everybody's everything. It looks like now they will go into effect July 30th or 31st, I think July 31st maybe, of this year.
Great, thank you.
I think if you're submitting before then, you have the option of submitting to either, but after July 31st, you'll have to submit to the newer code.
Makes sense.
Hi, this is Keith Fox. Are you guys able to hear me?
Oh,
yep,
yeah,
we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, Shauna's correct. The deadline is on July 31st is the last day of where they could use either code, and August 1st is the requirement for the new code to start.
Perfect. Thanks, Keith.
And then also, if anybody has any questions, they can feel free to contact me, either phone or email, with the IECC.
Right. And I think Christy presented your information at the beginning, but can you just give us your email again, Keith?
Okay, it's Keith, Keith, .Fox, Fox, @denvergov.org.
Great. Yeah, I'll CC Keith and Christy on my post-training survey email so that everyone has their information as well.
Perfect. And then Keith, I know that right now you guys are taking errata, not changes. You can't put in, oh, I want to change this. That process is done and over with. But there's, if you're reading through the code and you find an error or a conflict or something, that can go to you guys. How long are you accepting that errata, and how do people put in for that?
Okay, there's a link on our website, denvergov.org website, that has that information in the form to fill out and the email where to send it to. And
Perfect.
I believe they have until July 30th or July 15th, I believe.
Okay. Awesome.
All right, we'll give it one more minute if we do have any other questions, and then I'll go ahead and end the webinar.
Oh, and just so everybody knows, the errata, the timeline for that is we're planning on taking it to having it out for public comment around the 31st of July. And then after we get comments back, then we will go to City Council. The errata probably won't become official until September, October at the earliest.